Alright, so let's talk a little bit more about building a blog on Node.js and a little bit about some of the stencil code that we're going to provide to you. And hopefully by the end of this you'll understand exactly which parts of it you'll need to fill in, which parts are just there as part of the example. So the basic overview of the application is that there's an app.js file, which is basically our main, connects to MongoDB, and it actually includes everything in the routes folder. So in the routes folder, we actually have the routes for Express that we register and describe what we do when the user navigates to a certain URL. So for example, if the user navigates to the login, in the routes folder, that's where we have the code to actually handle what to do when the user connects to the login route. Now, at certain points, the routes actually need to access data from MongoDB, and the code for that is contained in sessions.js, posts.js, and users.js. So down here, these are the three files that actually have the code for interacting with MongoDB, and they correspond to the sessions collection, the posts collection, and the users collection respectively. So that's the basic layout of our application. So let's actually take a look at the code. Alright, so if we look at all the files we have here, we have our app.js, we have our routes, posts.js, sessions.js, users.js, and then our views, which contain our HTML files, which are just Swig templates that we render to the user. So let's start with app.js, just to start with our main entry point. Alright, so this is app.js. Notice that we require Express, we require Consolidate, MongoDB, and /routes. So I'll talk a little bit about this after I get through this file. This is the way I'm specifying a subdirectory, and we'll look a little bit more at how this works in a second. But if we go down to the main body of our code, basically this is our whole application. So we connect to MongoDB, we register our templating engine just like we did before. We have some middleware from Express because we need to access cookies and post variables in our blog. And then we delegate actually to our routes. So we pass in the app and a connection to this routes object. And then we just listen on port 3000, print out a nice message. So if we go back up here to the top of the file, we see that we have routes equals require /routes. So what's going on here? So what this is doing is it's telling Node.js that we want to include a local file. This isn't actually a module, because if we didn't have the /, it would actually look for a module named routes, just give an error message saying module routes not found, unless we happen to have a module installed for that. So let's actually look more into this directory and see what we can find. So notice that routes is actually a directory. So when we gave that require statement for /routes, we're actually saying to include this directory. What that's doing is it's actually including this index.js file. So there are more details about how the require statement works and how it looks up different files, but this is just an example of what happens when you use a local path and include a directory. So let's just take a look at index.js before we look at the rest of our routes. Alright, so this is index.js, and this is the function that's getting called when we call the routes function, because at the top of our app we had routes equals require /routes, and then we were just calling that function. So here we're saying module.exports equals function that takes an app and a connected database. And here we have some helpers that I'll show in a bit that actually have the content of the code that we use to deal with the routes. So if we look down here, we can see that we're registering all our routes. We do app.get /, and we actually pass in what's actually a function. So our content handler has a function called display main page. We're passing that to the / route for Express to use when a user requests /. We see something similar here. We have content handler.display main page by tag, content handler.display post by permanent link, and just all sorts of helper functions that we register with the routes. So this is basically our top level of the routes file where we're just matching routes with the work that we need to do. So now if we look down here, we can see that we have all these things to handle our session. So here we have get for the login form, we have the post for the login form, the get for the sign up form, the post for the sign up form when the user actually submits the sign up form. we have the welcome page, we have the logout page. That's all managed by the session handler. And then we just register some error handling middleware down here. As one last small thing I want to mention, we actually have our own middleware here. So we're saying app.use sessionhandler.isLoggedIn middleware. So this is actually to keep the code a little bit nicer, because every page basically needs to know whether the user's logged in, because the content of the page may be different. So this just contains that duplicate code as middleware, and it gets called every single time, no matter what route we're going to match. So this middleware will get called, and because we register all our routes afterwards, it'll get called before our routes. Alright, so we've looked a little bit about how we match the routes to the work that we need to do. Let's actually look at the content of that work. And soon we'll get to the actual database operations and the point of this homework, but I just wanted to really give a good overview of what this application is doing so you don't feel like there's magic happening under the covers. And the good news is that for the part you have to write, you don't have to really use this stencil code. You just have to use MongoDB. And so you don't really have to know how this works. It's just going to call your functions. So if we go all the way back up to the top, we can see that we have our session handler, content handler, error handler. That's /session, /content, and /error. So let's look again in our routes directory. We see we have content.js, session.js, and error.js. So notice we didn't include the .js, but Node.js actually tries to append the .js extension and see if the file exists. So notice that this behavior is different for a directory, where it actually looks in routes/index.js because it didn't find a routes.js in the top level.